The ballroom was exactly the kind of place that made certain people feel like they belonged, and made others feel every inch of the distance between who they were and who the room expected them to be. Crystal chandeliers hung low enough to catch the candlelight from 200 tables draped in white linen. Waitstaff moved between guests, the way river water moves around stone, quietly, efficiently, without disturbing the surface. Outside, the city skyline pressed its glittering face against the floor-to-ceiling windows, and inside, the guests in their tailored suits and floor-length gowns behaved as though they had never once noticed how bright their world was against the dark. This was the annual gala hosted by Heart Meridian Technologies, one of the 10 most powerful companies in the country, and the ticket price alone, $12,000 per seat, was enough to guarantee that the room would be filled almost exclusively with people who had never once had to wonder whether they could afford the ticket. Price. Almost exclusively. The event had been sold, on its promotional materials, as a celebration of innovation and community investment. The foundation attached to Heart Meridian had distributed nearly $40 million over the past decade to health equity programs and education initiatives, and the gala was the annual occasion on which the company's stakeholders gathered to acknowledge this generosity and to perform, in the aggregate, the particular theater of the wealthy doing good. It was a theater that Marcus Reed had attended enough times to understand its grammar. He did not resent the theater. Some of the good that got done inside it was genuine. He simply had no interest in being a performer. Marcus Reed stood near the edge of the bar, holding a glass of still water, and said nothing. He was wearing a charcoal blazer over a black shirt, no tie, and a pair of clean dark trousers that fit well but did not announce themselves. He was 43 years old, broad across the shoulders, with close-cropped hair that had started to silver at the temples in a way that looked less like age and more like weathering the kind of change that comes not from years, but from the specific weight of what those years contained. He was not uncomfortable. That was the thing most people in the room could not understand. When they glanced at him, and then glanced away, and then, inevitably, glanced back, he was not performing comfort, not gripping his water glass too hard, not scanning the room for an anchor. He simply stood there, inside his own skin, and watched. He had been watching for nearly 20 minutes by the time the first person approached him. It was a man in his late 50s, with the particular build of someone who had once been athletic and now carried that history in the width of his chest rather than its definition. The man looked at Marcus with the practiced half-smile of someone deciding in real time how to categorize him. His gaze moved from Marcus's face down to the blazer and back up, doing the math. "Are you with the catering team?" he asked. And his tone was not unkind. It was the tone of a man who had made reasonable assumptions his entire life and had rarely been corrected. Marcus looked at him for a moment before he answered. "No," he said, and left it there. The man nodded slowly, recalibrated, and moved on without further conversation. It was not the first time. It would not be the last. Marcus had learned over many years that a room like this one did not adjust its assumptions for you. You either spent your energy fighting the current, or you let the water move around you and watched to see where it went. He had long since chosen the second option, not out of resignation, but out of something that looked from the outside like patience, and felt from the inside like clarity. He had been called the wrong name at more than one of these events. He had been directed toward the service entrance of buildings he had been invited to enter through the front door. He had sat in rooms full of people who looked through him while addressing him, and he had learned to hold that experience without letting it tell him who he was. Not because it didn't hurt he was a human being, and it hurt in the way that accumulated erasure always hurts, quietly, in the places you stop mentioning, because mentioning them changes nothing, but because he had understood, at some fundamental level, that the opinion of a room that didn't know him was not the accurate measure of anything that mattered. He had been invited to this event by a woman named Dr. Patricia Okonkwo, a health tech investor who had been a client of his consulting practice for 3 years and who had, 2 weeks earlier, called him from what sounded like an airport and said, in her clipped and efficient way, that there were people at this gala he needed to meet, that he was wasting himself in the background, and that she would leave his name at the door whether he agreed to attend or not. He had agreed to attend. Dr. Okonkwo was not at the gala yet. He had checked his phone twice. Evelyn Hart appeared from the far side of the room, the way certain people appear without announcement, but with a gravity that reorganized the space around her. She was 38 years old, and she moved through the crowd the way a woman moves when she has spent long enough being underestimated that she no longer needs to announce herself. She wore a deep green dress that hit just below the knee, her hair pulled back simply, and she carried no clutch, no companion, no visible performance of the role her name was supposed to require her to play. She was the CEO of Heart Meridian Technologies. She had taken the company from 40 employees and a failing product line to a $4 billion valuation in 11 years. The business press called her brilliant. The financial press called her ruthless. Her mother called her difficult. She had stopped paying attention to what she was called somewhere around the time the company crossed its second billion. She saw Marcus before he saw her. She stopped moving for exactly 2 seconds, not long enough for anyone nearby to notice, but long enough for the air between her and the past to shift. Then she resumed walking, changing course, crossing toward the bar, and when Marcus turned at the sound of approaching footsteps, the expression that crossed his face was not surprise exactly. It was closer to the expression of a man who has been carrying a quiet expectation for a long time and has just seen it confirmed. "Marcus," she said. "Evelyn," he said. Neither of them reached for a handshake or a hug. They simply looked at each other across the narrow distance, and in the looking was the full weight of everything they had not said to each other in several years, and everything they had once said in a single year that had mattered more than most people's decades. Victoria Hart had been beautiful once, in the way that powerful women from old money are often described as beautiful, sharply, coldly, in a manner that was less about warmth and more about architecture. At 67, she retained the posture, the jewelry, the precise arrangement of her silver hair, and the absolute conviction that she understood how the world worked. She had grown up in a family whose name appeared on hospital wings and university buildings, and whose social obligations were less invitations and more responsibilities. She had married well a Hart by birth himself, a convergence of two branches of the same financial dynasty, and she had raised her daughter with the understanding that there were people in this world who belonged in certain rooms and people who did not, and that the maintenance of that distinction was not cruelty. It was simply order. She had been watching her daughter from across the ballroom for 6 minutes before she moved. She had watched Evelyn cross toward the bar with the purposeful step that always meant she was heading somewhere she had chosen, rather than somewhere she was expected to be. She had watched the tall man in the charcoal blazer turn at Evelyn's approach. She had watched her daughter's face do something she had not seen it do in years, soften, just slightly, at the edges. And something in Victoria's chest had contracted in the way it always contracted when she sensed a variable entering an equation she had already solved. She set her champagne on the nearest available surface and began to cross the room. She was not rushing. She never rushed. She moved with the deliberate pace of a woman who had learned that the most effective entrance is the one that allows everyone in the room to notice your direction before you arrive. Several people greeted her as she passed a nod here, a brief smile there, the minimal currency of acknowledgement among people who have known each other for 30 years and no longer need to perform their connection. She barely registered them. Her eyes were fixed on the man standing beside her daughter, and with every step she took, she was composing the geography of the moment, who was nearby, who might be watching, what angle of approach would be most effective. She came to a stop a few feet from Marcus, close enough to make the conversation unavoidable, at an angle that placed herself between her daughter and the rest of the room. Evelyn saw her coming, and her jaw set in the quiet, practiced way of someone who has been having the same argument for 20 years and has developed the ability to brace for it without visibly bracing. Marcus noticed the shift in Evelyn's posture before he noticed the woman who caused it. He turned. He looked at Victoria Hart for the first time. Victoria looked back at him. She took in the blazer, the lack of tie, the water glass, the ease with which he occupied space that she felt he had not earned. Then she looked at her daughter, and in her daughter's eyes she read something that made her decision final. She smiled. It was the smile of a woman who has never once been told she has gone too far. "Evelyn," she said pleasantly, as though the man standing 3 feet away were furniture. "I've been looking for you. Congressman Peters has been asking about you all evening." "I'll find him later," Evelyn said. Victoria's smile did not change. She turned slowly, deliberately, and let her gaze land on Marcus with the full and considerable weight of her disdain, dressed up just enough to pass as curiosity. "And who is your friend?" she asked, in the tone of a woman asking about a stain on the carpet. "Marcus Reed," he said, before Evelyn could answer. "Good evening." Victoria looked at him for a moment longer than was strictly polite. Then she turned back to her daughter, with the expression of a woman who has identified a problem and is about to address it efficiently. When she spoke again, her voice was still pleasant, still measured, still carrying the particular confidence of someone who has never once been wrong in a room like this one. But it was pitched just high enough, just clearly enough, that the couple standing 4 feet to the left could hear every word without quite being able to pretend they hadn't. "I want you to know," Victoria said, looking at her daughter, then letting her eyes slide briefly back to Marcus, "that it is men like this, men who show up in spaces they were not built for, who present themselves as something they are not, who are the very reason my daughter has refused to marry. You undermine what a real partnership looks like. You confuse women who deserve clarity." The couple 4 feet away stopped their own conversation. A man nearby lowered his glass without drinking. The nearest waiter slowed imperceptibly. The ballroom did not go silent. A ballroom never goes entirely silent. But in the small radius around Victoria Hart and the man she had just addressed, the air thickened in the way that air thickens when something has been said that cannot be unsaid, and everyone within earshot was holding themselves very still. Marcus Reed did not move. He did not change his expression. The hand holding the water glass was perfectly steady. For a long moment, 3 seconds, 4, he said nothing at all, and in his silence there was no humiliation, no wounded retreat, no performance of patience for the benefit of the watching crowd. There was only a man choosing, with great care, exactly what to say next. Then he said, quietly, to Victoria Hart, "Ma'am, are you sure you know why she doesn't want to get married?" 15 years earlier, the city had been the same city, but Evelyn Hart had been a different person in it, or rather, she had been the same person, but without the armor the years would eventually provide. She was 23 years old, and she was sitting in a conference room that she had rented by the hour with money she no longer had, making a pitch to a group of 4 investors who had already, she could tell from the way they held their pens and the way their eyes moved, made up their minds. She sat very straight in her chair, and she spoke very clearly, and she did not stop when one of them checked his watch, or when another one exhaled through his nose in the particular way that men exhale when they have already discounted what they are hearing. She finished the pitch. She thanked them for their time. She walked out of the conference room, went into the single-stall bathroom at the end of the hall, locked the door, sat down on the closed lid of the toilet, and put her face in her hands for exactly 4 minutes. Then she washed her face, straightened her jacket, and walked out of the building. She had 3 employees at the time. 2 of them had not been paid in 6 weeks. The third was her, and she had not paid herself in 4 months. The product they were building, a health data coordination platform that would allow different healthcare systems to share patient information across providers without compromising privacy, was technically innovative and practically necessary and commercially invisible because the people with money to invest in technology in those years were investing in things they could explain to their parents, and health data infrastructure was not among them. She had been rejected 17 times in 8 months. Her company had 43 days of runway left. It was her mother, in those months, who had most consistently advised her to stop. Victoria had never been deliberately cruel about it. She had been practical, in the way that Victoria was always practical, laying out the numbers, noting the pattern of rejections, pointing to the parallel examples of companies that had burned through their founders' savings and produced nothing. "You have a good education," she had said on more than one occasion, "and a strong name. There are other paths." She had also, on one occasion that Evelyn had never forgotten, made a call to a man she knew, a director at a large financial services company, and arranged, without asking, for Evelyn to be offered a position that paid 4 times what the startup was costing her. Evelyn had declined the offer. Victoria had not spoken to her, really spoken to her, for 3 weeks after that. The seminar was held on a Thursday evening in a co-working space, 2 floors above a coffee roastery, and the air in the elevator smelled like dark beans and old wood, and Evelyn went because she had seen the flyer in the lobby of a building she had a meeting in, and because the topic was operational resilience in early-stage companies, and she was desperate enough to spend a Thursday evening in a folding chair if there was a chance she would hear something she hadn't already tried. There were perhaps 30 people in the room. She sat in the third row. The man who stood up to speak was not who she had expected. He was in his early 30s, and he spoke without notes. And he talked not about funding strategies or investor relations, but about the internal architecture of a company, how communication breaks down, how teams fragment under financial pressure, how the difference between a company that survives its first crisis and one that doesn't is almost never the product. It is the people and the systems that hold the people together. After the session, she approached him because she had a specific question about resource allocation, and she was not the kind of person who sat on specific questions. His name was Marcus Reed. He worked for a nonprofit that provided operational consulting to community-based organizations and small businesses that couldn't afford traditional consulting firms. He answered her question carefully, and then he asked her one in return. And the conversation lasted 40 minutes and covered the specific structural failures in her company that she had been diagnosing incorrectly for 6 months. She called him the following week. He came to her office, which was then a corner of a co-working space where she paid for a single hot desk, and he spent 2 hours asking questions. He did not bill her. When she asked why, he said that he was between projects and that her problem was interesting. She accepted this because she had no other choice. What she did not know at the time, and would only understand much later, was that he had chosen to help her with the same directness and absence of transaction that characterized everything he did, not because he expected something in return, and not out of pity, but because he had a genuine and particular belief that the projects most worth working on were usually the ones that the money had not yet found. Marcus Reed had grown up in a city that was not this city, in a neighborhood that did not appear on the maps that the people in this ballroom used to navigate their lives. He had been raised by a woman who worked 2 jobs and never asked for acknowledgement, and had taught him, by example rather than instruction, that the most durable form of integrity was the kind that operated identically whether or not anyone was watching. He had put himself through a state university on work study and late nights, had spent his 20s learning the operational mechanics of organizations that served communities with no budget for operational mechanics, and had developed, through that work, a diagnostic eye for the specific places where good intentions collapse under the weight of poor structure. He had seen companies fail, not because their ideas were wrong, but because no one had built the internal systems capable of carrying those ideas from conception to execution. He had made it his particular work to fix that quietly, competently, without the kind of visibility that converted work into currency in the rooms where currency was accumulated. He did not avoid visibility out of false modesty. He avoided it because he had learned, early and through specific experience, that visibility in certain spaces came with a cost that was not always worth paying, and that the work itself, the actual work, the unglamorous structural repair of organizations that were trying to do something worthwhile, was diminished rather than enhanced by the performance of credit. Over the next 8 months, Marcus Reed helped Evelyn restructure her team's internal communication, introduced her to a network of mid-level operators in the healthcare industry, who became her first real clients, connected her with a program officer at a foundation that provided early-stage grants to health technology, and spent 3 separate Saturday mornings helping her rewrite the narrative of her pitch, not the financial projections, not the technical specifications, but the story of why the problem existed and who it harmed when it went unsolved. The 17th round pitch had gone nowhere. The restructured pitch, delivered in the same kind of conference room to a different group of investors 9 months later, closed a round of $2 million in 11 days. Evelyn had said, afterward that she needed to talk to him about payment. He had told her, simply and without drama, that his payment had been the outcome. She had told him that was not acceptable. He had said that he would accept dinner at whatever restaurant she chose. She had chosen a place that cost $400 for two, partly as a test and partly as a genuine attempt at proportion. He had come in a clean shirt and ordered thoughtfully, and spent the dinner talking about everything except the company, because the company was done, and what he wanted to know was what she actually thought about what she read, what she feared, what she believed the world owed to the people it had not yet gotten around to serving. She had not had a dinner like that in years. She was not sure she had ever had a dinner exactly like that. She had thought about Marcus Reed many times in the 11 years since then. She thought about him clearly, without the distortion of romance, which had never been what was between them, and without the distortion of nostalgia, which she permitted herself only in small doses. She thought about him as the person who had been present, without agenda, at the moment she needed presence and the absence of agenda most. She had never found an adequate way to explain this to anyone else, including her mother. She had long since stopped trying. "What do you mean by that?" Victoria said, and her voice had lost none of its precision. But something in it had shifted a hairline fracture in the smooth certainty that had carried her across the room. "I mean," Marcus said, "that you've told me what you think about men like me, but you haven't said anything about why your daughter has made the choices she's made. Those might not be the same conversation." "You presume," Victoria said, "to know my daughter better than I do." "No," Marcus said. He did not raise his voice. He did not move closer. "I'm asking whether you do." Evelyn, who had been watching this exchange with the stillness of someone deciding whether to intervene, spoke. Her voice was quiet, but it carried. "Mother," she said, "stop." Victoria turned to her daughter. "Evelyn, I said stop." Evelyn looked at her mother for a moment, and in that look was everything she had ever decided not to say in rooms like this one, everything she had set aside in the interest of continuity and function, and the maintenance of a relationship that had never quite been the one she needed it to be. "Marcus didn't come here tonight to be a lesson in your argument about my life." A woman in a silver dress a few feet away had stopped pretending to look elsewhere. A man with gray at his temples and the careful posture of someone accustomed to being watched had turned, very slightly, in their direction. The moment had expanded past the point where it could be contained by the parties involved. Victoria straightened. She looked at her daughter, then at Marcus, then at the small audience that had assembled without anyone having issued an invitation. When she spoke again, her voice was still controlled, but it had the particular control of a person applying pressure to something they know is cracking. Men who cannot provide stability, who cannot offer a foundation, who enter spaces they have not earned. These are the men who teach women that dependence is weakness and independence is the only answer. I have watched my daughter refuse every reasonable offer because she has surrounded herself with people who do not understand what a real commitment looks like. Marcus set his water glass down on the bar. He turned to face Victoria fully, not aggressively, not with the squared shoulders of a man about to fight, but with the full and quiet attention of a man who has decided that the person in front of him deserves to be answered honestly, regardless of what that costs him. He looked at her for a moment before he spoke, and when he spoke, his voice was unhurried and entirely even. "No, ma'am," he said. He let those two words sit for a breath. "What made your daughter unwilling to marry is not men who couldn't meet a standard. It is the idea that someone else gets to set the standard for who deserves to be loved. That's not protection. That's a different kind of damage." The ballroom breathed. Victoria Hart did not have an answer. She stood in her 3-inch heels, in the center of her daughter's company's most important annual event, in front of 40 years of curated social authority, and she did not have an answer. It was a feeling she had not had in a very long time, and it moved through her like cold water, and she stood very still in it. A hand touched Marcus's arm lightly, briefly, and he turned to find a man in his early 60s, with a close-cropped white beard, and the easy authority of someone who has spent decades being listened to. The man extended his hand. "Robert Calloway," he said. "I don't think we've been formally introduced, but I know who you are." Marcus shook the offered hand. "Read Operational Partners," Calloway said. "You turned around the Weston Health Network 3 years ago. You rebuilt the governance structure at Meridian Community Foundation before that." He paused. "You also set up the scholarship program at Northside Technical Institute. My nephew went through that program. He's a network engineer now. He talks about that scholarship like it gave him his life back." The woman in the silver dress was listening openly now. Two more guests had moved close enough to hear. A man who had been standing at the far end of the bar had walked over without quite knowing why, drawn by the gravity of what was happening in the way that people are drawn, without being able to explain it, toward moments that are larger than themselves. Evelyn watched the room reconfigure around the man she had known for 15 years and had never once asked to be anything other than exactly what he was. She watched the information about Marcus land on the people around her, the scholarship fund, the consulting work, the businesses rebuilt in the spaces where wealth had not thought to look, and she watched their faces change, and she felt something that was not quite vindication, because vindication required that she had needed to prove something, and she had never needed to prove anything about Marcus to herself. What she felt was closer to grief, the quiet, functional grief of someone watching the world understand something 15 years too late. Victoria was watching too. She stood slightly apart from the small group that had formed around her daughter and the man she had so recently and so publicly dismissed, and she watched Robert Calloway speak about Marcus Reed's work with the particular warmth of someone who has seen that work in its effects on a human being they love. She watched two other guests nod in recognition. She heard someone say that they had heard of the scholarship program, had even contributed to it, had never known who founded it. She watched Marcus accept the acknowledgement with the same ease with which he had accepted her dismissal, without performance, without swelling, simply standing in the information, the way he stood in everything, as though it changed nothing essential about the nature of the moment. She had been wrong. She had been wrong in the specific and catastrophic way that people are wrong when their certainty has been the architecture of every room they have ever entered. And when that certainty crumbles, it takes the room with it. She had stood up in front of her daughter in a ballroom full of people she had known for decades, and she had said something that she had believed with her whole chest, and she had been wrong, and worse, she had been wrong about a person, not just a fact, and that kind of wrongness was the kind that sat in you differently afterward. She thought about all the men she had approved of, men with the right family names, and the right quarterly earnings, and the right membership in the right clubs, men who had made her daughter miserable in ways that Victoria had noticed and found acceptable, men whose deficiencies were the kind that came in pressed shirts and went to the right parties and were therefore invisible to the diagnostic system Victoria had spent her entire adult life refining. She thought about how many times Evelyn had ended one of those relationships, and how each time Victoria had attributed the failure to Evelyn to her standards, her independence, her unwillingness to compromise, rather than to the structural error in the selection criteria itself. "The first year," Evelyn said, and her voice had the particular quality of a person speaking from somewhere deeper than public composure, "I had weeks where I didn't know if we were going to make payroll. Not struggling to make payroll. Not delayed. I had weeks where I genuinely did not know if the people who had trusted me enough to come work for this thing I believed in were going to be able to pay their rent." The room was listening now in the concentrated, unified way of a crowd that has been converted from audience into witness. People had stopped their own conversations. The waitstaff had stilled. Evelyn stood with her hands loose at her sides and her voice steady, speaking not to any one person, but to the air in the middle of the circle that had formed around her. "My mother told me during that year, more than once, that the company was going to fail. She wasn't wrong to think so. The numbers supported that conclusion. What she was wrong about was what I should do next." Evelyn paused. "She thought I should step into something that already existed. Take the job that someone had arranged for me, marry the right man, and let the right man carry the parts of my life that were too heavy." And I understood why she thought that. I understood it completely. But I also knew that if I did that, the version of me that walked into that safety was not the same version of me that existed before. She looked briefly at her mother. And the things I most needed, I had already found them. They didn't come from where she expected. She looked at Marcus. There was a man who showed up and didn't ask me for anything, except the problem, she said. He didn't want equity. He didn't want credit. He didn't want me to owe him. He wanted to see if the thing was solvable. And when it turned out it was, he was satisfied by that. Just by that. She stopped. I have spent 11 years running a company and meeting extraordinary people. I have never once met anyone who did what he did, the way he did it, for the reasons he did it. And that what he taught me is the reason I am careful about who I let close to me. Not because I have given up on people, because I have seen what people are capable of at their best, and I am not interested in settling for less. The room was very quiet. Victoria Hart was looking at her daughter, and for the first time in a very long time, perhaps for the first time in Evelyn's entire adult life, she was listening without the simultaneous process of evaluation and response. She was simply listening, and what she heard was not the rejection she had always interpreted her daughter's choices to be. She heard a woman who had learned, in the specific and difficult way, that life teaches its most durable lessons, what she valued and why. She heard a woman who had not arrived at independence through damage or stubbornness or the refusal to love, but through the experience of being genuinely seen once, in a formative moment, by a person who had nothing to gain from seeing her and having been unable, since then, to accept substitutes. Victoria thought of her own marriage. She thought of it carefully and clearly, as she rarely permitted herself to do in rooms this well lit. She thought of the 38 years of social performance and managed distance. She thought of the mornings she had woken up next to a man she respected and could not reach. She thought of the specific species of loneliness that lives at the center of a life that looks, from the outside, like everything it is supposed to look like. She had given her daughter the architecture of a cage and called it a foundation. She understood this now, standing in the middle of her daughter's ballroom. In the specific and unignorable way, you understand things that have been true for a long time and have simply been waiting for you to stop moving long enough to see them. Victoria Hart had apologized twice in public in her 67 years. Once at a board meeting, when she had miscalculated a financial projection, and the error was unambiguous. Once at a memorial service, when she had spoken too briefly about a woman she had known for 40 years, and realized, mid-eulogize, that she had been too occupied with her own grief to honor anyone else's. Both times, the apology had been precise, contained, and motivated by the incontestable presence of an error. This was different. This was not an error of calculation. This was an error of sight. It was a different thing entirely to stand in a room full of people you have spent your entire life impressing and admit, not that you had done the math wrong, but that the system you had used to do the math was built on a foundation of things you had decided to believe because it was convenient to believe them. She walked toward Marcus Reed, slowly, and the small group around him parted with the particular attentiveness of people who sense that something important is about to happen and want to be close enough to witness it without being close enough to interrupt. She stopped in front of him. She looked at him without the assessment she had used earlier in the evening, without the inventory of his jacket and his water glass and the gap between what he was and what she had decided he ought to be. She looked at him as a person. It was harder than it should have been. It was also the most honest thing she had done in years. "I owe you an apology," she said. Marcus looked at her. He did not fill the silence. "I looked at you, and I saw what I was prepared to see," she said, "not what was there. I made assumptions about you that were based on things that have nothing to do with who you are. I said something in front of people that was unkind, and it was incorrect, and both of those things are my responsibility." She paused. There was more she could have said, more elaborate architecture she could have constructed around the admission, but she chose not to. Some moments are best held in their smallest form. Marcus was quiet for a moment. The room waited with him. "I appreciate that," he said. And he meant it not in the performed way of a man accepting an apology to end an awkward situation, but in the genuine way of a man who understands that it costs something to say what she had just said in front of these particular people. and who is willing to acknowledge that cost without diminishing the debt it was being offered to settle. Then he said, in the same quiet and unhurried voice, "The value of a person is not in the way they walk into a room." He let that sit for a breath. It's in what they leave behind when they walk out. No one who heard those words could have explained afterward precisely why they affected the room the way they did. They were not, on their surface, an extraordinary construction. They were not designed to be. What they were was true and truth. In a room that has been organized around the careful management of truth, has a particular resonance the way a single unmodulated note sounds clear and strange in a space that has grown accustomed to performance. The man named Robert Calloway began to clap. It was not the explosive applause of a crowd caught up in a moment, but the slow and deliberate applause of someone who means it. A woman nearby joined him, then two more people. Then, in the way these things happen, the room found itself standing. Victoria Hart did not clap. She stood in her corner of the room and watched her daughter's face, which was not performing joy or vindication or any of the emotions that a moment like this is supposed to produce. Evelyn's face was simply the face of a person who has carried something heavy for a long time and has just been given permission, finally, to set it down. Victoria watched her daughter's face and felt the specific and irreversible understanding of a woman recognizing the precise location of her own failure and knowing, with the certainty of someone who has spent her whole life being clear-eyed about everything except herself, that she cannot fix it backward. She can only begin from here. She took a step toward her daughter. Not the decisive step of a woman enacting a plan. A smaller step, tentative, uncertain, the step of someone trying a door they have kept closed for a very long time and not yet sure whether it will open. Evelyn looked at her. She did not close the distance immediately, but she did not step back. She had spent the better part of her adult life understanding that her relationship with her mother was not going to become the thing she had needed it to be when she was young enough to need it. She had made a kind of peace with that, not the peace of someone who has stopped wanting, but the peace of someone who has stopped waiting. She had built her own structures. She had found her own foundations. She had learned, slowly, and through the specific curriculum of hard experience, to distinguish between the people who showed up with conditions and the people who simply showed up. She had organized her life, as much as any life can be organized, around the latter. What she had not expected, what she had stopped allowing herself to expect, was to stand in the center of her own ballroom on a Tuesday night in November and watch her mother take a step toward her without the armor of an Axapine agenda. It was such a small step. It was a step that most daughters received at an age when they could still be formed by it. Receiving it now, at 38, after everything, was a stranger and more complicated gift than she had words for. But she stood in it. She let it exist. And in her chest, something that had been braced for a very long time released its hold, just slightly, just enough to let the air back in. Later, much later, after the speeches had been given, and the fund had been announced, and the crowd had begun its slow dispersal into cars and conversations, and the particular suspension of feeling that follows a night that has been, in some way, larger than anyone expected, Marcus Reed stood for a moment at the top of the steps outside the ballroom and looked at the city. He had his jacket over one arm, and the night air was cool against his shirt, and the skyline was doing what skylines do, which is to hold the light of millions of lives in a form too large and too complex to understand from any single vantage point. He was not thinking about the evening in the way that a man thinks about a triumph. He was thinking about it in the quieter way that he thought about most things, going over the texture of it, the specific weight of each moment, the places where something had shifted, and the places where it had not. He thought about Evelyn, and about the version of her he had known 15 years ago, the woman in the folding chair, asking a specific question about resource allocation, not performing humility, not performing need, simply bringing a problem to the room and asking for help with it. He thought about how rarely he had met people like that. He thought about how much he admired what she had built, and how little of that admiration had ever needed to be said out loud, because some things are most honestly expressed by simply continuing to show up. He thought about Victoria Hart. He did not think about her with anger, because he had not felt anger during the evening, or rather, he had felt something pass through him when she had spoken, something he had recognized as the reflex of anger, and had watched without acting on, the way you watch weather from a window when you have learned that weather is not personal. He thought about what it would take for a person like Victoria Hart to say what she had said in that room in front of those people. He thought it had probably taken more than he was inclined to give her credit for. He decided to give her credit for it anyway. The door opened behind him, and Evelyn came out. She stood a few feet away from him, looking at the same skyline, and for a while neither of them said anything. This was a thing they had always been able to do, occupy silence together without filling it, which was rarer than most people realized. "My mother is still inside," Evelyn said. "Is she okay?" "I think she's doing the thing where she processes it by talking to people she doesn't actually need to talk to," Evelyn said. "She'll be all right." Marcus nodded. "I'm sorry," Evelyn said, "for what happened tonight. You didn't come here for that." "I came because Patricia Okonkwo left my name at the door and told me there were people I needed to meet," he said. "I think the evening delivered on the description." She smiled. It was a small smile, the kind that doesn't need an audience. "Marcus," she said. Then she stopped. She seemed to be deciding whether to say the thing she had been not saying for longer than the evening. "I want you to know that what I said in there, it wasn't me performing something for the room. It was true." "I know," he said. "I'm not sure you do," she said. "I'm not sure I've ever actually said it to you. What you did for the company. What you did for me. I've never." "Evelyn," he said. She stopped. "I know," he said again, simply, and with the full weight of a man who means two words to carry the entire history between them and knows that they can. She was quiet for a moment. The city moved below them, indifferent and magnificent. "I'm still not getting married," she said. "Okay," he said. "Not because of damage or fear or any of the things she thinks." "I know," he said. "Because you've seen what it looks like when it's right, and you're not going to pretend." She looked at him. "You always did that." "Did what?" "Finish the sentence before I got there." He said nothing, but the corner of his mouth moved, and she saw it, and they stood for another minute in the comfortable silence of two people who have known each other long enough that the spaces between words carry as much meaning as the words themselves. Eventually, Marcus Reed put his jacket on, and he said goodnight, and he walked down the steps and into the city, and the door closed softly behind Evelyn as she went back inside, and the night resumed its ordinary motion around the space where the evening had been. He had left nothing behind that anyone would be able to point to the following morning. No speech, no grand declaration, no gesture designed for the history books. He had simply been present and honest and unwilling to be made smaller than he was, and that had been enough. That was the thing about Marcus Reed, that the room had not understood when he walked into it, and had understood, by the time he walked out of it, completely. He had left nothing behind that anyone would be able to point to the following morning. No speech, no grand declaration, no gesture designed for the history books. He had simply been present and honest and unwilling to be made smaller than he was, and that had been enough. That was the thing about Marcus Reed that the room had not understood when he walked into it, and had understood by the time he walked out of it, completely. He did not carry the evening with him in the way that a man carries a victory. He carried it the way you carry something that has finally been said lighter than before, settled, finished in the way that things are finished when they have been allowed to be what they actually are. He thought about the scholarship students, the ones he had never met, the ones who had gone through the program and built lives that were genuinely their own, and he thought about the fact that none of them knew his name, and that this was, to him, not a failure of recognition, but the cleanest possible form of success. You leave something in the world continues with it. That is enough. The city held its light. The ballroom behind him was still glowing. Evelyn Hart was inside, beginning the slow and imperfect work of rebuilding a relationship with her mother from the point they had actually reached rather than the point either of them had pretended they were at. Victoria Hart was inside, doing something she had not done publicly in decades, sitting with the discomfort of being wrong and allowing it to teach her, rather than retreating into the more comfortable terrain of being right. And the room itself was carrying forward what had happened in it. The way rooms carry forward the significant moments that occur inside them, not in their walls or their chandeliers, but in the people who were present, who would go home and think about what they had witnessed, and carry it, in some quiet form, into the days that followed. The night, as nights do, continued forward into whatever came next. Prejudice teaches us to see surfaces. Truth teaches us to see people. Between those two lessons is every room we have ever entered and every version of ourselves we have ever had to decide to become.